Thank you everyone for joining us on our webinar today on how to supercharge ServiceNow QA with 360-degree testing by CapIO. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do this webinar this month is because, as of a few years ago, automated testing for ServiceNow was relatively unheard of. And CapIO was one of the first applications specifically built for ServiceNow to help companies kind of update their testing methods and bring that into the 21st century. And what we've done since then, since the years, since the years of us having created CapIO and brought it to the market, is we've also created some methodologies that help you encompass multiple levels and types of testing across every facet of your business. And we're going to get into the details of that in just a little bit. Now, if you're not familiar with Cerna Solutions, let us introduce ourselves. We specialize in developing cutting-edge solutions and unmatched consulting services, which are aimed at improving the way and maximizing how you're able to use ServiceNow. And we provide both products and services which are focused on automated testing, service portal consulting, and virtual administrative services, just to name a few. So right now, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Sal Costa. You may already know him from his worldwide fame. He is our principal architect in our products and integrations department, and he has his background in software engineering and computer science, over 8 years in ServiceNow. He is the lead developer for us on CapIO, and he specializes throughout his career in enterprise application and automation. Sal, go ahead and take it away.
Hey, thanks, Tim. I appreciate that introduction there. Worldwide fame. Well, that's an interesting one. So yeah, before I get started, I'd like to give a little bit more about my background on myself and specifically my experience and how I got started in automation. When I first got out of college, my first job was actually as a manual QA tester, so I have a deep knowledge of the subject. When I joined that job, they sat me down, they showed me the product, and they gave me a test plan of about 400 test cases to execute, and that's what I was responsible for. That test plan was a complete mess. It was all over the place, completely disorganized, tests were deprecated and everything. It took me a little over a week to execute that end to end. And right about the time I'd finish one execution, there'd be a new build. I'd have to start the whole cycle over again. And I did this over and over for a couple of months as I learned the ropes. Of course, I was right out of college, so I was still a little nervous about my profession. I'd probably still be executing it today, but I decided I didn't like where this was going. I didn't want to have to keep doing this over and over again. And I wanted to try and see if I could actually automate it. Didn't really even know what automation was back then, just knew that it was what I was doing was not efficient. So I spent some of my own personal time, spent a lot of late nights at the office there up in Boston, but I was able to reduce my effort down from about a week to less than a day. So with all this new free time, now I've got 4 free days a week, basically. I didn't just wait and play video games. I went out, I added more test cases. I helped coworkers with their test plans. They got behind if they were on more complex ones. And I also started to help the release engineering team. That's what we used to call DevOps, or what we call DevOps now. Eventually, the manager of that team, he must have liked me, so he offered me a position which included writing installation kits and maintaining the build processes and labs that we had there for testing. Of course, because I'm such a fan of automation, I automated all that as well. Everything about the build process was completely automated, including creating the installers and testing them and everything, which again left me with a lot of open time. And then I proceeded to start to bug the professional services team, where I eventually moved and kind of set me on my path of where I am today. So there's a lot of reasons to use automation, but what I think this story, my personal story, shows is that there's really 2 important ones that I care about. The first is to reduce the cost of whatever you're trying to automate. Right? You've got to get this testing cycle down as much as possible. The second is to free up resources to create value in other areas. Those were my goals then, personally, and they were kind of selfish at the time, but now with CapIO, I'm trying to recognize those same goals for other organizations, and we do that through 360 testing. So before I go too much further, I do want to give a good definition to what we're calling 360 testing. As Tim mentioned, it is a methodology that seeks to automate every type and level of testing and integrate those processes at each stage of the development cycle. This can be everything from enforcing test-driven development on the story form within ServiceNow to automating the execution of acceptance or performance tests at the very end of a cycle. So let's start with looking at a typical situation in development, and this is ServiceNow testing without any automation. You'll start with some allotted time here. It's just usually called a sprint, but in this sprint, developers will pick or be assigned stories for development. Developers will do their work. And then they'll be expected to perform some sort of testing. Usually, this involves a really informal test. It might be a unit level test where someone just individually tests a single piece of code or configuration, or it might be another type of ad hoc test where they manually go through and verify the change through the UI. Development will usually continue in this manner here, dev test, and then at some point we need to introduce some higher level system testing. We need to begin to tie and test some of these functions all together. This might be the same developers doing the testing. It might be a separate QA team. Some really disorganized places I've seen, business analysts and application owners, and not that these people are not qualified to test, and they certainly know the application and the requirements, but it's still a bad practice because those people, developers, BAs, project managers, they all have a vested interest in getting the story to a done state. And they may want to avoid creating more work by going and uncovering defects. So it's usually best to have a dedicated person if it's going to be done manually. And this means more resources. To meet deadlines, this testing is usually done concurrently with development. And this basically means that the testing team has to try and hit a moving target now. Because of that, because testing almost always goes beyond what we've been allotted, it will typically extend into what we call unplanned time. It may actually bleed into another sprint too, but in any case, we weren't planning on the testing to go over like this. And another result of the testing, which is the intent, is that we're going to find defects. Those defects need to be fixed. Those fixes need to be tested again. So you can see we enter a cycle where it just kind of keeps extending it out. And although we all know this to be the truth, it's almost impossible for us to plan and to anticipate these changes because we just don't plan to fail. We don't plan to find defects. We want everything to be happy and positive, and sometimes we just don't think that it can possibly go further. Incidentally, here, if we are cut in this cycle here, where we're developing and we're fixing defects outside of a sprint, this can actually break your agile process. If you don't retroactively go back and fix that story, either increase the estimate or move that story to another sprint, eventually your velocity will get so off that your sprints will be impossible to estimate here. So it's good to keep everything in the allotted time. It's good to keep everyone honest, and so having things go into this unplanned time is really a negative. At some interval, either daily or at the end of the sprint or the end of the release, the code is going to need to be promoted to a test instance, right? And ServiceNow usually recommends a dev test prod at least for your development. And at some point, we need to move it to that middle environment to test the changes and then also to test the update process. Here we might introduce some integration testing. And this differs a little bit from the system testing. The system testing before that we do really focuses on a single type of functionality within an application. So the system test may focus directly on client side form logic or a business rule or a workflow. Integration testing really, in ServiceNow terms, really wants to test the interactions between those different components. So does a business rule trigger the workflow correctly? Does it send out a notification correctly? Does this button take me to the correct report? We might know that those individual functions work on their own, but how do they work? How do they work together in the greater application? This is usually going to be in some allotted time. We usually do plan a little bit for testing, or at least most times we plan a little bit for testing. But usually what happens is this allotted time, whatever we've got here, is usually reallocated back to development because we've not adequately added in time for defect fixes or fixing before or testing before, and that allotted time dries up pretty quickly. And then of course, we do tend to underestimate the amount of effort that goes into testing. Certainly, manual QA testers put a lot of effort into testing it and testing it properly. And when we find defects, we know we've got to go back and retest those again. So again, it keeps adding to this cycle. After the integration testing, we probably want to do some sort of acceptance testing. This is usually the most common testing that we see in ServiceNow. People don't typically think too much about the low-level pieces, the unit system integration, but what's on everyone's mind is definitely that end-to-end process in the various ITSM and other applications in ServiceNow. Those are usually well thought out, and people have those developed, and so that's typically the only thing that gets executed, and that in and of itself can take a while. And again, the intent really is to find defects from this. We want to flush out any defects as early as possible. Even getting them in this phase, this test phase, is still a lot more expensive than if we were to find them in this development phase, because what's in between this is more time. And I don't want to throw developers under the bus too much, but the more time a developer has between the change they've made and when the defect is found, the more they're going to forget. If I've got to go back and fix something that I coded weeks or months ago, I'm going to have to reacquaint myself with that. It just becomes much more expensive. So the earlier we can find those, the earlier we can notify developers, the quicker and the less expensive those fixes are going to be. So now let's take a look at the process, the same process here with CapIO and with the 360 methodology kind of plugged in and enabling us. It really starts. This whole process will start, with the developer, and because of the speed of the automation, being that it's so much faster than manually testing, what we want to try to do is run our test continuously. After every story, at the end of each day, we want to be able to run those tests so we know right then and there when a defect or when a failure occurs. 360 testing really tries to automate the processes and all of the glue and interactions between each of those phases here. So between the developer and the unit testing, unit and system, and so forth. Let's take a quick deep dive into one of these phases here so I can show this exploded view. For the sake of this diagram, we did kind of expand these just so we could get the text on the screen, but do keep in mind that these unit tests and these system tests are pretty quick here. So again, as I mentioned before, the 360 testing does start at the story level, kind of off the screen here, and we'll kind of continue with the developer doing their work, and then closing their story or marking a particular story as complete or ready for testing. Within CapIO and with 360 testing, this will automatically trigger those unit tests to work. So there's nothing that the developer needs to do now to start those unit tests. They've always got the option if they want to manually execute it, but it's much safer that these things are automatically triggered. They will get the results as soon as these are done, and we can also then proceed immediately using CapIO right into the system testing, which again will send out a notification when it's done. The unit testing is pretty quick, right? This is always done from the back end. It's usually a smaller test plan in general, and I in my own testing, I'm seeing results in a few minutes with this one. System testing, depending on the scope of what you've got included in there, may take between 10 and 20 minutes. Still much faster than what a person could do, and we're getting those results a lot sooner. Let's jump back out to the expanded view here. We may also choose, because we have the option now, we may also choose to run this acceptance or integration testing a lot quicker. Again, I mentioned daily, but we may also even run it multiple times a day. Really depends on how much work and how much development is actually going on. And usually, with the result of all this, with all these speed ups and all these automated triggers between the different phases, we do tend to end up with some time remaining here, and it's with this time that we can start to over deliver. We can do additional testing, manual testing if we want. We could do other types of testing, so performance testing and so forth. We can simply add more stories to the sprint because we know we've got more time. We can polish or harden the code, or we can simply be done sooner. So before moving to the technical demo, where I'm going to show how we implement a lot of these things, I just wanted to point out that this development is not just a straight line. It is a continuous cycle, and if we could find a way to shorten that cycle or introduce that additional time at the end, those benefits will really start to accumulate and have a positive effect on the business. So we can really turn around a negative situation into a positive one. So let me switch over to my browser view here, and we'll start to walk through some of these different scenarios. So what we're looking at here is a ServiceNow instance. I've got CapIO configured, and I've done a little work to configure and enable this 360 testing within this environment. The first thing that we want to do, though, before we even get to the point of configuring or making changes to the system, is we want to decide on a testing strategy overall for our development. As I mentioned, I think that the core, the base amount that you want to do is definitely a unit test. This will give you those quick results. They allow you to do, if you choose, test-driven development. These ones are, because we can also use developers as the resource for these are actually end up being pretty easy to do within CapIO and ServiceNow. System test I also definitely recommend here. If we, for one, these are also very easy to write because each system test can test one specific thing. They're all, they're completely independent of a larger test. It makes it very easy to write. And we'll show you some of the code here, but with CapIO, it makes it a 5 or 10 minute exercise. The performance or integration test, the next level there, these ones I kind of consider more optional, depending on the amount and scope of changes that you do. The integration test may be overkill, or it may be too redundant with the system or acceptance tests. So it kind of depends on how many interactions that you've got going and whether or not you want to introduce that into your cycle. Performance is definitely, again, optional. It's something that I would leave to the end. I actually probably wouldn't automate that as far as the 360 process goes. But just overall, if you've got a lot of customizations or you've had issues in the past with performance, it might not be a bad idea to look at introducing a little bit of this into your cycle as well. Definitely the most important one here is the acceptance test. We definitely want that. This was the bread and butter, and the first real goal of CapIO was to get through and automate these acceptance tests. And so it's very important to the cycle. We want to make sure that before any end user, business owner or application owner sees this, that we've gone through the acceptance test that is their definition of the process. So again, acceptance, system, and unit, we definitely want to require. We're going to leave these other two optional in this case here. We can use some of the same rules to enforce those, but we'll leave them open for now. So this is the configuration for the system test here. The only thing I want to really point out on this is, this is where we're going to do the configuration, but we set it up for functional testing. Basically, we want to simulate the user using a browser. And we've tied this to our application here, ServiceNow. We can go beyond ServiceNow with CapIO. We can test other applications, other web applications, and even some desktop applications. We can use CapIO to test those. The main benefit of using the ServiceNow plugin here is that you do get those 300 and I think we're up to 340 future-proof commands. So I'll hop back over to my test plan. So actually, let me shoot over to the story page now. This is where we want to start our integration here. So I've started with a basic story form here, and I've added a couple of fields to this. I've added the unit test suite, so we can decide, we can use this to link up what container we'd like to hold our unit tests for the story. Same thing with system. These can either be defined manually or inherited. Another thing I've added to this form for automation purposes later is the update set. And I'll show you how we can actually use this link here to automate some of the later stages of the process. Now, because not every change is going to require a unit test, things like changes to the front end don't lend themselves well to doing the unit tests within ServiceNow. I want to require that just at least one single test automation is assigned or related to this story before I can even move it to in progress. So I've done that with just a business rule here, and I think this one has no test cases. So if I even try to force this or move this into work in progress here, I should get a message gently reminding me that that this is not able to move. This is telling me story cannot move into a working state without one or more automated test cases. So this is going to force me to at least create those and start to think about that automation up front. I don't want to put too much on the developer because we are in ServiceNow and it really lends itself well to these sort of things. We can give them the ability to do stuff like create those automated test cases for them. So I've got these values specified here. I can just go ahead and create these, and these will create the stubs for me. So it's at least taking one of the steps out of the process here. I don't need to go looking for where to put this. I don't need to go out to a separate system. I just get them linked directly in here. And if I want, I can even go directly now at this point and write those tests. We don't need to write it before we start, but we definitely need to make sure that that automation is done before we move to testing. And again, we can enforce that in a lot of different ways. Checking to make sure that they're created is okay. We could even look into these records and make sure that a script is actually defined for those test cases. So we don't allow people to sneak by with just creating an empty test case. So before I move on, I'll show you what the unit and system tests look like for this record here. This story here. Let's see. We're just actually, let me jump over to this one here. This one here. This story is the one that we want to pick and work on, and this one is asking the developer to populate the company from the caller's company. Just pull that record and have it cascade onto the incident form here. So this one looks like this in a unit test. Pretty straightforward. It uses the same ServiceNow code. We wrap this in our test harness and give it the ability to report back and everything. But the code that tests this is the same code that you would use in a background scripts page that you might use within the scripting or the business rule itself. We want to create the record, set some fields, and insert that record. Down here at the bottom, we've got our validation, and this is telling us that the validation under this will have some code to just make sure that the company was set to the proper value, that we've got the expected value for the user that we used. Oop, back to the wrong one. And let me show the system test again here, the system test real quick. This one will actually use the CapIO API, so the test will look a little bit different. Instead of just validating it from the back, validating that change from the back end, we actually want to go through and validate this the same change through the UI. In this case here, it takes a little bit different path because we're going through the UI. We want to actually navigate to that incident form, fill out the same values, save the record, and then again we want to do our validation to just make sure that we check that the company is again set to the correct value based on that user. So those are very simple. This this right here would not take more than 5 minutes to really even write, and if you take advantage of some of the no or low code options, might even take shorter than that. So at this point, once we've got these tests defined, and once we've got them linked up to our story, we'll be able to move that story to work in progress and actually begin to do that work to the system here. So I would go through. I would do go back here. I'd actually do the work on the system in this case. Just implement this business rule. When I was done with that work, all I need to do is move this into testing in QA. I've used the out-of-box states here, but we could easily add another state here that is start automation if we still wanted to leave this available for any manual testing. But for this demo here, I've actually used that as my trigger. And once I do that, the next phase will start. So where that's actually configured is within the unit test plan that we set up at the beginning. We've got this notion of triggers, which does that automatic execution of the test. And in this case here, I've set my condition for execution to be whenever a story moves to testing. And I've qualified that by saying that the product that the story needs to be under is under this product. This should be our ServiceNow development. So whenever any story moves to in testing, that QA testing state, it will automatically trigger these to run, and it takes usually just a couple of minutes for this test to go through the whole process. When it's done, we will, if it fails, notify the developer. Because I'm a developer and I'm all techie and enabled with all new cool stuff, I want that notification to go directly to Slack. And so what this one looks like here, we've got the ability to, when a test fails, simply send out a REST message. And I've got some configuration here that will allow me to send that message, and I can give it a template here, simply telling me that this test run failed here. If it passes, we can set up a trigger for the next phase, which is that pass that unit testing, that system testing. The interaction here between system and unit and system can be automated as well with the triggers here. And the trigger for this one looks like this here. When a test passes, and the test that we're talking about was the unit test, start this test. Very simply. So if it doesn't pass, it won't go. If it does, it'll continue on to this phase. At the end of the system test here, we've got a couple of different notifications that we may want to send out. If the test completes and successfully, we'll just notify the original developer. We can send them an email, and that will be directed to the person that started the original test. So we don't have to spam everyone in the group every time. We can just let that original developer know that, hey, everything was good. If the test fails, rather than having to have that original developer come back in and create a defect, we can automatically create a defect for them and have it link back to the original story. Within each of the test cases and the test cases and the story, we've got the links between them all, so we can actually go through and automatically link all this up. So we don't even need to go out and look at the results ourselves. We can get them forwarded right back to our queue. So at this point here, we would end up here at this last notifier, and at this point we can really close the loop on this whole process. If there's more work to be done, if the developer needs to fix something in the code, this process will kind of complete or just will run again. And again, I just want to mention too that this this is happening pretty quickly. That unit test is a few minutes. That system test is maybe 10 to 20 minutes. So within 30 minutes, they really do have that full view of did this change actually work the way it was intended to, and where's my proof for that. Beyond this, we may want to move into automating some of the acceptance testing. If I go back here to my acceptance test, I can show you one of the kind of clever ways that we can automate this is through a trigger within this test plan. And I want to start off by making sure that we at least try to run this daily. So we'll make sure that this trigger executes every day at around 8 p.m. After people will have gone home. But instead of just blindly running it here, we can also add in here an advanced condition that will look through the stories to make sure that they've actually been completed. And what we're going to use here for our condition is to look at that update set field. Remember, we've set that on the story. We've created the link between the story and the work and the update set. And if, as a developer, I move that state to complete or have the system automatically move it, this trigger will actually look at that and use that as the condition as to whether or not the acceptance test will run. There are other parts of this too. This will be looking to point to the test system, so we can actually set up mechanisms between the two environments to automatically move those update sets. So, really, this is taking a lot of the work that would normally fall on the developer and automating it from the testing. As long as everything is passing and working correctly, they don't really need to ever touch it again unless there's an issue. So this is, after this development and after the acceptance test passes, we've really moved. We'd really be moving on to the deployment stage, and that's kind of outside of the scope right now of what CapIO and 360 testing would handle. You can go beyond with the testing. You can use CapIO itself to do the things like the performance testing and run additional tests if you want. This is again, those are things that I would, and especially the performance testing, things that I would not automate only because of the load and the coordination that needs to go into running a test like that. It's also important to remember that this whole process here, this 360 testing is a methodology. So not all of these rules, all of these triggers, and all of these tests are configurable. They may not be applicable to your environment, or may not fit within your process. But what is important is that we do try to introduce automated tests as early and as often as possible, and to automate the integrations between each of those phases of development. So that's pretty much it for me. I hope you guys found that presentation useful. And Tim, I'll turn it back over to you for any questions that may have come in.
Sure. Awesome. Thanks, Sal. Yeah, we've actually had quite a few coming through while you were doing the presentation. And we'll just get started on the first one. They were wondering why you would want to create two test cases for the same story or functionality.
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, there will be some overlap between what those test cases are actually validating, but there are certainly times in ServiceNow and outside of ServiceNow where there will be a difference between implementing the code from the back end and front end view. And I'll give you an example. Right before, or with CapIO, when we were, when I was developing this or setting up this test, there was code that worked properly through the back end. When I ran it manually through background scripts or through the unit test, really, it worked correctly. When I ran it through the front end through clicking a button, it did not work correctly. So even though it was the same function, it was all tied to the same story. It was a very different result when I ran it in the two different ways. So if the type of change that you're doing could be affected by that, it might not be a bad idea to create both of the test types there. If it's something that's only on the front end, then you don't want a unit test. You actually probably can't even do a unit test. You'd only be looking at that one single test. So you've got to weigh the effort to writing those tests against the type of change and figure out if that test case is actually necessary. That's a great question, though.
Okay. And yeah, I know that obviously we've jumped into the question and answer period now, but obviously we're still taking questions, everybody. So if you're able to still hop on and throw some more in there, we're definitely happy to take those on. I know we've got about 5 minutes left until the end of the presentation, but we don't mind staying a little bit late if you don't mind, and we'll be happy to try to answer as many of these as we can. Another question that we just got in was, are there any limitations on what can or cannot be tested?
No, so just going by the different levels, the unit test, the scope of those, again, will be things on the back end because it does use ServiceNow code to execute them. Anything that could be executed from the back end can be coverable from a unit test. The functional tests, those system and acceptance and integration tests, use the CapIO functional test module. And with ServiceNow, as I mentioned, we do have over 340 commands now that we use to cover all of the UI, and that includes everything from the navigation menus, forms, fields, lists, service catalog, service portable, service portal, surveys, risk assessment calculator, everything that we can find in the system that has a unique UI, we've developed an API for it. And so we haven't really found any limitations. And if we do encounter anything, if we've got new features that come out in ServiceNow, or we bump up into an area that we haven't seen before, we will add those commands to our framework. Beyond that, and I mentioned that we've got the ability to test other applications outside of ServiceNow. We do offer, an additional 100 or 150 commands that are much lower level that allow you to interact directly with the browser, not going through our API, but interacting directly with the components on the screen. And those themselves will allow you to test anything outside of the scope of CapIO API, anything non-ServiceNow related, or anything custom. A UI or custom UI, a UI page or custom UI macro could be tested by those functions. So no, there's not. And if it goes beyond anything like that, we do have capabilities on the back end to do other types of testing. As I mentioned, we can do the performance and we're able to plug in other tools in there. So if there's anything beyond that scope, I'd say see me after class, and we can discuss how that could actually be implemented.
Great. I had another question that just came through on how much can these conditions be customized?
So if we're talking about the triggers, those have a lot of inbuilt abilities to conditionalize themselves, and then we've also, wherever possible, I've tried to add an additional layer of scripting so more advanced users can go through and create scripted conditions. So the whole. I don't like when I use a product and the options given to me are very limited. I like to make it easy for new users and non-technical users to see it and understand it. But I always want to give a path for those pro code users. So everything that I do has options and hidden things and advanced conditions that are built into it that allow you to get to the next level. And because it's all in ServiceNow, anyone that has those advanced conditions has those advanced skills can take advantage of that and build a process like this. Great.
Now we have someone I noticed. I think they're current customers of ours that had a question in terms of is 360 an additional add-on that the CapIO tool to the CapIO tool, or is it something that needs to be implemented? Or something that can be implemented now, rather.
It's something that would be implemented now. It's separate from the product, and the reason I wanted to keep it separate from the product is because we wanted to actually keep CapIO agnostic as to the other tools that you use in your development process. So we've shown it here for the Scrum module in ServiceNow, but frankly, we've created those triggers and those notifiers to we've set those up so that those could be used for external systems as well. So we've created this process, and we do have obviously the code to do it in ServiceNow, but we did not make it part of that core product. And another reason is we don't want to modify other applications from within our CapIO application. So it is and will probably always be separate update set that we install or something that we implement or help you implement.
Okay, and so if someone wanted to go about doing that, what are the steps for that?
Well, if you're a current customer, I would engage us through support, and so we can talk about exactly what parts of this process you want to enable, and we can either give those customizations to you or show you how to customize it. If you're a new customer, certainly engage us, and we'll talk about those things straight away. So as we go through and do this implementation or install CapIO, we can do those customizations at the same time.
Okay, great. Perfect. That person who asked the question just gave us a smiley face. Now, are you able to kick off the test via workflow activities such as a dev test release workflow? And if so, so if the test workflow activity kicks off the test and if successful workflow continues to release? So I was trying to read that as verbatim as I could.
Yeah, so those are some of the hidden features. They're not exposed on the UI there, but what we do give as part of the product is the ability to script those things or do them from things like workflow. So while we don't expose them on the UI, we do give you access to some of the backend code that triggers those. And it's just a couple of lines to actually trigger a test. Those can be brought into a workflow activity, scripted workflow activity. There's probably actually half a dozen ways that we could trigger those different pieces. So yeah, we can do it we can trigger those from within anywhere in ServiceNow, and from almost any other tool outside of ServiceNow that can support webhooks or integrations. So yeah, there's a lot of flexibility beyond what you saw there.
Great. What about, someone had a question about, are you able to mix API and UI commands in a single script?
Yes, you actually can. It's a little bit more advanced. You can, within the functional test, we do allow you to automate running like the backend code there. It requires that the person that's performing the test or the user that is using that or running that test is an administrator. Additionally, because of the way we've built the backend, as I kind of alluded to this before, we have the ability to plug in completely different types of testing. So the functional tests that we've built actually have, there's a few hidden commands in there to do other things besides talk to the browser. One of the really cool ones is from within a functional test, we can actually send an email from the server. So that means that this is not anything that goes on through the UI. It's done completely through our back end, but we can send an email out from that system to test things like inbound email actions. That's not something you would ever see, you'd ever see built as an API or even begin to try to do with other products. But because of the way we've built it, we can do that from ours. And so yeah, mixing and matching. Creating new types of functionality is definitely supported in the functional side. From the other side, from unit tests, we can't mix the commands in that way, but the functional one is really flexible. We can do a lot from that.
Awesome. We do have another webinar coming up next month on the Agile Guide to Building Amazing Service Portals in ServiceNow, and that's hosted by our portal guru, Jeff Pierce. So if you guys are interested in learning some more about service portals in ServiceNow, or if you guys know anyone else that should probably attend that, definitely follow the link that should be coming up on the screen now into your chat. Yep, there it is. And go ahead and sign up for that. We will be sending out an email to everyone with a survey. So if you guys have a chance to give us your thoughts on what you thought of this webinar and webinars you'd like to see in the future. We're also going to be sending out this recording to the webinar as well as the slide deck on Monday. So take a look for that and feel free to contact us with any other questions that you have that we might not have covered, or if you'd like to see a demo of CapIO for your organization, definitely contact us and we'd love to reach out and answer any questions that you have. Again, everyone, thank you for taking the time and sticking through with us on this webinar. We really do appreciate you guys spending your afternoons with us, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do this again next month. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sal.
Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it.